Very good afternoon to you. This hour, last night in Ballymena in County Antrim, 2,500 people took to the streets to protest, in some cases violently. Police have said 15 of their officers were injured, 4 homes set ablaze after an outbreak of disorder last night following an alleged sexual assault. There's social media footage showing armoured police officers carrying plastic shields in response to the protests in Ballymena. A 29-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of riotous and disorderly behaviour, attempted criminal damage and resisting police. The PSNI said officers had attended a planned vigil to ensure an appropriate and proportionate policing response. Now, the reason the disorder started is after an alleged sexual assault in the area over the weekend. 2 14-year-old boys had earlier appeared in court charged with attempted rape. Obviously, those teenagers cannot be named, and they spoke through a Romanian interpreter. Now, we obviously have to be extremely careful here because there are charges in this case. What I'm very interested in, given the violence, quite widespread violence, are the comments of the local MP, what you make of the legitimacy, as he sees it, of the protests that then turned violent. This is the North Antrim MP, Jim Allister, claiming the violence followed a peaceful protest over mass migration. He said, within Ballymena, there have been rising concerns about the sheer scale of migration into the town, and that would have been a factor in the wholly peaceful protest. All that to be distinguished from the wanton violence which then followed, with obviously a minority of that peaceful crowd wanting to take advantage of that to visit violence which wasn't wanted or warranted, hence the scenes we saw. He says, it is very distressing to see scenes of violence on the streets of Ballymena. It is easier to start than to stop these things. There has been a bit of authorities not wanting to face up to the racial background of some of this over the years. He says, the unchecked migration, which is beyond what the town can cope with, is a source of past and future tensions. That is the reality of it. Those who came onto the street last night, in the main, had a perfectly legitimate purpose and cause of being there, end quote. And I wonder what you make of that, because we have had overall in this country, to the United Kingdom, record numbers of inward migration, never before seen numbers coming into the country. In England, and in fact across the country really, those arrivals have been greeted peacefully, probably because we are now quite used to high levels of migration. Certainly the cities are. Do you therefore think it is a perfectly legitimate thing for people to protest the level of migration to their particular area? Do you worry that the levels of migration could act as a source of anger? If you are angry at the levels of migration, what is that anger fundamentally rooted in? Is it rooted in, as some would have it, a degree of racism, a degree of xenophobia? Not that you would admit it, I'm sure, but there might be those who would take to the streets about the colour of the people who have turned up there or where they've come from. Or is it something else? A justifiable anger, not that I would take to the streets about it, but a justifiable anger that you were told migration would fall and migration numbers exploded. Should what started out as peaceful protest last night that turned violent be dismissed as racist, xenophobic? Or do you think that the number of, indeed the relocation of people who have arrived in this country is becoming, to your mind, a legitimate thing to protest about, in part given the apparent lack of democratic consent for it? Because if you're willing to take to the streets peacefully, no one is here to try and justify the violence. If you're willing to take to the streets and peacefully protest about the new makeup of the area in which you live, what is that protest fundamentally rooted in? Because a lot of people are going to describe those protests as fundamentally rooted in a racism, in a xenophobia, or is it something else? 03456060973. Timothy Gaston is a TUV MLA for North Antrim. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme this afternoon. Can I start with what happened last night? What you saw, what you heard, what the fallout has so far been from what was, on the face of it, some pretty nasty scenes?
Yeah, thanks for having me this afternoon. I was in Ballymena last night along with over 2,000 people to stand with the victim's family. The victim in this case is a 14-year-old girl who suffered a vicious sexual assault.
Well, we've got to be extremely careful there, Mr. Gaston. Sorry to interrupt you. You have to be extremely careful because there are charges in that case. So let's not go around making presumptions about who is and who isn't a victim until justice has played its part, or taken its course. But to the violence that you witnessed.
So I joined over 2,000 people who walked around Harryville last night. They held deeply legitimate concerns about how Ballymena has changed over the years. This isn't a new problem. This is an issue that has been bubbling in the background for, I'm sure, 10 years. The protesters, we walked around Harryville. We went to make our way over Harryville Bridge, and we were met with a number of police vans, meat wagons, which then stopped people from continuing on their walk up Ballymena town. So, we can't lose sight of a couple of thousand people, men, women and children, that come onto the street last night holding deep concerns about the demographic change in Ballymena. This violence has overshadowed that. It has taken away from the reason that many people attended last night, and indeed it will put people off attending again. But I am very clear that then people, I was standing shoulder to shoulder with them last night, showing our support for the family and what has happened to that young girl. It's sad for me that what was a peaceful protest, a legitimate protest, turned into the scenes, and we've seen the violence from it. But let me be very clear, it was only a small handful of people, and a number of them were from outside Ballymena that came in, and it seems to be they came in last night with an intent to cause violence and cause trouble.
So let's spool back a bit, Mr. Gaston. Sorry, let's take this back a bit, because you say that this anger has been bubbling for quite some years. So describe, if you would, the way in which your part of the world, the way in which Ballymena has changed demographically, and to what extent.
Well, if we go back a number of years ago to pre-COVID, there was a bus service that ran directly from Romania, bringing people to Ballymena. Roma seemed to come to Ballymena. Some of them came to work, but a lot of them came because there was availability of housing. And certainly that then started to create this tension that people were getting favoured. They were getting handouts given to them. They were getting preferential treatment. And that then started to see the demographic change in certain areas. And that's essentially what happened in Glenavan last night, where the anger was subject and was focused on. That was where the alleged assault has taken place. And that's where there's been the biggest concentration of Roma that have come into Ballymena, and that's where they've been sitting.
And is the anger... Let's separate it from what is alleged to have taken place, because again there are charges in that case. Is the anger at the people who have come over the course of those years, or is the anger primarily at the politicians who have, quote, allowed this to happen or encouraged this to happen, or you describe being given preferential treatment to those people?
There's a lot of anger has been built up that there's a cost of living crisis going on. People are finding it hard, but yet people are coming to this country. They're being put up in hotels, they're getting their food, they're getting money to stay here, while people living locally are struggling to get past. We have pressures in housing, we have pressures in our NHS system, we have pressures throughout society, and yet there's an influx of people that nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to deal with that concern. And having, working class areas of Ballymena transformed into places where a landlord has come in and they potentially put 6, 7, 8 people into the one house. One of the biggest problems has been that the Roma culturally don't integrate the same way as other people. Now, migration isn't a bad thing, because we have depended upon it from years ago when Portuguese came over, great workers, fitted into the community, get involved in the community. The latest wave of people coming in is Filipinos who have been working in Wrightbus and keeping that factory open and helping it to grow. Once again, integrating with society, joining church groups, joining community groups, and being widely open, with open arms, and brought in to Ballymena. But there has been this element of people that have come in, completely different culture to local people, and have feared people because they're hanging around in gangs, all young males, and that has caused a lot of concern and a lot of unrest.
So this is an anger at what is being perceived as a lack of integration, or a need to integrate with a particular type of person from a particular culture.
That is part of the problem. Absolutely, there has been that lack of integration, that lack of want to.
And how does that change, Mr. Gaston? Because it strikes me that these protests would only, in theory, continue until someone does something. So what is the something that someone can do?
Well, for a long number of years, we have been calling for better targeting of money. So, I was the only one in the budget this week to call out in our Northern Ireland Assembly, the budget that's going through at the moment. There's £5.5 million for different schemes for tackling immigration and integration into society. And I don't believe any of them policies and any of them schemes are working. We need to get back to the drawing board. We need to relook at this, redouble our efforts, because certainly this is a powder keg, essentially, a tinderbox of people holding legitimate concerns, but then you have this element who've come in the back of that and caused waves of trouble across parts of Ballymena last night. That is not reflective of Ballymena. That's not reflective of the people that turned out to stand with that family last night. And may I say that this isn't the only alleged sexual assault that's happened in Ballymena over this last number of weeks, and that's a growing concern that people have. Northern Ireland is the unsafest place for a woman in Europe, and we have this Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is the flagship strategy by the Executive Office. And I think we could be doing things a lot better.
All right.
I was speaking to somebody last night, and it's a case of, well, what's that money? How is that money being spent to try and help situations like we found ourselves in last night?
Okay. Well, I'm very grateful to you coming on and describing that anger as you stood with those protesters, the peaceful protesters at least last night. Thank you for coming on the programme. Timothy Gaston, Traditional Unionist Voice MLA for North Antrim.